Hello, welcome to No Veto Video. I'm Catherine.
And I'm Carson. This week we'll be telling you about the movie Mimesis from 2011 that you can find on Screambox. The director is Douglas Schultz, and it stars Ellen Maldonado, Sid Haig, and David Grease.
Mimesis, strictly speaking, tells the story of a group of sci-fi or horror con goers who are forced against their will to participate in the events recreating the classic film Night of the Living Dead.
So, I had watched this about a year ago, very reluctantly. It took me about a year after I had heard of it to watch it. I would see it listed and think, this sounds low budget even for me. But after a while I just decided I'd try it, and it wouldn't be the first movie that I got 5 minutes into and then just said, nope, moving on. But the acting was nowhere near as bad as I was expecting. The writing actually became fairly interesting after they got past the opening, just to see what they were doing with it and how true to the George A. Romero movie they were going to keep it. So I know you found some problems with the acting.
I think Carson's being very generous here. I think it's good for everyone to know right off the bat that I despised this movie. There was very little about this movie that I found compelling or worthwhile. It's not common on No Veto that we have one that is such a significant miss, but this one is a real stinker for me. I didn't find much to enjoy about this film, and it starts with the acting. It wasn't as bad as you were expecting. It was considerably worse than I was expecting. It was just very wooden in places, and there were too much and too little, and all the choices felt off, or I don't have very much cohesive to say about the acting, given how routinely unpleasant it was. A standout, though, maybe in the other direction, who sort of seemed to be giving the movie what the movie was asking for, was the Alfonso Betts character, which is played by Sid Haig. He kind of plays this B-horror movie director that you might see at one of these cons. He has this long kind of monologue at the beginning of the film, and then comes back into the film very near the end of it, and has another long monologue there. It seems to be that that's like the heart of this movie, and I think he delivered what the filmmakers had in mind for this character. But even there, I found it an uncompelling performance.
So, as you were saying, at the beginning, it feels like he was framing what the movie was going to be about. And at the end, it was sort of like a recap of what the movie was all about.
And for me, that was such a ham-fisted idea, that we needed that kind of framing, that it set my teeth on edge right from the beginning. And then when it came back again, it was just an unwelcome intrusion into the story. Thank you, I can figure out, yes, it's very obvious what you're going for here. No problem, I got it, thank you. I don't know that it was a necessary character, but clearly, as an actor, he was giving them what they were looking for.
I think he does become important at one scene, but not because of his speech at the beginning or nearest to the end. He kind of is a plot device at one point. But, yeah, they probably could have been a little less ham-fisted with that. Costuming, I thought, was done pretty well. I mean, the costumes didn't fit the actors very well. Their starting costumes did, but when they were cast in the roles of unwitting participants, the antagonists had just shoved whatever looked appropriate on them, regardless or not of whether it fit. And I think that added a little realism. It didn't look tailored. They didn't have a lot of time just to measure everyone and go get things fitted.
I will give you that. I've got nothing to say.
Okay.
This is true. What Carson is saying is true. There you go.
So you found a redeeming quality in this film.
Still didn't like it.
So, plot-wise, did you feel like anything had been overdone, or?
So here's the basic question that the filmmakers seem to want to explore, which is sort of what are the roots of violence? It's an interesting thought to explore, but throughout this plot, I'm not saying plot dismissively, but there is this through line of story. It's just so, like, their answer, or rather their negative answer, there is, like, what it isn't, is so plain that it's difficult to stick with them through the whole thing. It's sort of, it's like a junior high essay, where you're supposed to, you tell them what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them, and then you reinforce what you're telling them, and at the end you conclude by telling them what you've told them. And those essays are painful to read, and this movie was in some ways painful to watch. Mm-hmm. There's a character in Night of the Living Dead that serves as sort of a diplomatic force, or a gee guys, can't we all just get along kind of force. There's a character in this film that kind of serves the same role, until suddenly he doesn't. And suddenly he's acting in a totally contrarian way to the way he'd been presented all along. And there's a sort of a sense of, like, where'd you go, dude? Like, why are you suddenly, like, somebody totally different than you were before? And there's not a compelling reason why. It's hard to... Sometimes there would be these sudden radical shifts, like, someone is a damsel in distress until suddenly she, grows a spine. Somebody is a relatively reasonable, mother who cares about protecting her child, until suddenly she's entirely, focused in another direction. It's like, what? Okay, fine. Like, I guess.
Although, I agree with you, until I had an experience with you a few years ago at Gen Con, playing a game of Nascrag, where a player just completely shifted not just what their character was doing, but it felt like they shifted personalities drastically.
And it was wildly unbelievable then. Like, there was something terribly wrong. And it messed up the flow of the table. Like, her way she had been was unpleasant and difficult, but at least we'd found kind of a way to make it work within the confines of the story we were all telling together. And then when she goes totally off into, like, the whole other direction, it messed with the flow of the table. And that's, I think thank you for making my point. So, alright.
So, if you could change one thing about this movie that would make it more enjoyable, what would that one thing be?
I think I wouldn't have had it gather its characters from a convention. Yeah, I think there would have been, if they had removed the framing around it, if it had been sort of more out of nowhere, then I think even just changing that probably would have rendered it a more enjoyable film, for me at least. And I don't think I would have lost, like, the point of it at all. How about for you? Anything?
Well,
one thing that you would change, that you would, like, increase your enjoyment of this film?
I want to say a couple of things to what you said first. I see that, but I also feel like maybe it would end up being too much of a cliche. Kids just go into this town in the middle of nowhere, get kidnapped, thrown into a...
Well, no, I mean, I think the premise is that they're nearby or adjacent to, a large metropolitan area, but they're, the character for whom that would mean the most, that they had come from the con, is gone within the first, few minutes of the film. And it's sort of like, well, if that one character who had this, like, deep emotional attachment to this art form is now gone, what does it matter where the rest of them came from, you know?
The other thing I thought of was the director character, who you said did the best job of going for what they were trying to get to, but felt extraneous. I think could be worked in better with what you were saying you would change. They could have had him as not a witness, but as just a source that the police were talking to. Like, why do you think, as an expert in horror, this was going on? Or and they could have worked him in better, maybe that way.
So ultimately, and it becomes obvious, I think, fairly early on that you're dealing with something that's like that they're not in a zombie film.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it becomes obvious that there's other stuff going on.
And they do never actually even imply that. So it's...
I don't know. Maybe. But then it becomes a sort of cat and mouse tag, or, like survival, like hunter and prey experience between the protagonists and the antagonists. Even at the end, when the antagonists give their antagonist speech, like, there's still a part of it that's like, yes, but that's ridiculous. Like, that's beyond silly, and nobody talks like that. Like, there's so it's hard even to like fully invest in the like combat between the protagonist and the antagonist, because the antagonists are so ridiculous, so silly.
To answer your question on what would have made it more enjoyable for me, and this may be a little of what you were touching on earlier, but one of the characters, when they find out some of the people among them are actually spies or whatever, who are just reporting back, or maybe helped get them into that mess in the first place, those people mostly seem to have done it unwittingly. They weren't really any more culpable than the rest of the people there. The one guy just kicks them out and lets them die. Or whether or not they do die, sets them up to die. And I think that, one, that wasn't really keeping with his character the way he had been portrayed the rest of the time. And two, like, seriously, who does that?
Yeah, that was my major complaint about that character. Is that we'd set up this, like, the guy himself and the character he was emulating, and neither of them should have taken that step.
Yeah, in the original movie by Romero, that character never lets anyone die. He does everything in his power to save as many of the people there as he can, even though they're trying to kill each other at a few points.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things, of course, that you always have from many horror movies, and Night of the Living Dead is certainly an example of that, which is there is an external threat, but often what tears apart our communities comes from within, and the uneasiness that we have with being out of our element and having to work together with people that we don't know and we don't trust. And some of us take to that very readily, and some of us, find that an insurmountable challenge. And, so there is a bit of that, certainly in the 1968 film. Mm-hmm. And I think they try and replicate it here, but it ends up just being a bunch of people standing around and yelling at each other, because I don't think you have that sort of same, like, depth of feeling that you have with the Night of the Living Dead.
Another thing that's a little interesting, some of the characters almost played their roles a bit too well. I mean, it's not like any of them were rehearsing for a role in a recreation of Night of the Living Dead. So the fact that the people cast as, like, Johnny and Barbara and Ben were actually fulfilling those roles pretty well seems a bit of a stretch, unless at the point where they realized what was going on, they subconsciously decided to, but I don't really think that's how people work.
Yeah, I figured, so the characters were pretty thin going in, they were pretty thin Like, and so then you have this veneer of the Living Dead stuff, and most of them didn't feel like they were, like, too good for the roles. It just felt like the bad guys maybe really lucked out and found, like, a fairly good fit for all of them. Pretty convenient for the bad guys.
Well, and some of them even looked like the roles, like the diplomat you were talking about, the guy who's trying to get everyone to play nice, looks pretty much like the original character. I mean, a lot of them, and it could have just been the way they were made up, but I don't know.
So there's that.
I think it would have been a little more interesting if the people were thrust into the same situation, but not maybe acting the same, so it wasn't as predictable.
Let me pose a question for you. So the title of the film, Mimesis, is defined by one of the characters within the film, is the idea that life will imitate art. Is that what's going on in this film, or is it something a little different? I mean, the guy says, oh, well, you're just doing this thing, Mimesis. And for me, it's like, no, that's a totally, like, the imitation of art is just totally, like, tertiary to the whole of what they're doing. And that, like, you may want to, like, pin it on this, but it's not that either.
Well, the director also says, besides that, he also says that people commit these crimes because there's something wrong with them.
But then they come back at the very, very, very end. There's a scene between a police officer and a journalist, and by the way that they've written the lines and the way that the lines are delivered, and then the scene is cut, the emphasis is on, and they what movie was it that they were imitating? Like, what is, like, this idea of like it's about mimesis, and that, like, the problem is mimesis, and it's like, no.
I felt that was believable, though, because at least I'm a few years older than you. I remember a lot of articles in newspapers about this record album caused someone to go on a murder spree, or this video game causes violence, or whatever. So as a child of the 80s and early 90s,
Okay, I'll give it to the journalist and the cop, but I don't give it to the director.
That's fair.
How about that?
So with regards to pacing, I felt the beginning was a little slow, but most of the rest of it seemed to go at a decent rate, not too fast or slow. How did you feel about the pacing?
Again, Carson has found a thing I have nothing to complain about. Especially if we give me the caveat of taking away the stuff at the conventions. It clipped along at a fairly good pace.
That's one of the things that held my attention the first time I watched it. I'm prepared for most B horror movies to just have horrible pacing, and it feels like it drags on, and you couple that with subpar acting, and it just becomes unbearable. So I think they did that well. Sounds like you're in agreement.
Compromise. That's what we find here on Ovito Video. Compromise.
Overall, I think this isn't a bad movie if you're just looking for something and you're bored, especially maybe if you've had a couple of beers already. I wouldn't recommend, like, having this be your movie that you just want to show all your friends. That probably won't work unless your friends meet every week for bad movie night. I know people like that. That's their thing. This would be a great movie. If you're watching, use this movie at your movie night.
And I say, learn a lesson from Carson. Don't show this to other people. There are other films that you might want to check out instead, and we'll get to that after a while. So, a takeaway, a last thought?
Overall, it wasn't a horrible movie. There are many things they could have done better. It's not a movie I'd be revisiting. It's not one I feel the need to watch every year or even every decade.
For me, a last thought would be there's lots written about the interplay of race and gender in Night of the Living Dead, and some of it, the original filmmakers didn't necessarily intend, but have certainly provided a rich conversation point, for all the years since. But I think there's really no room for modern directors to not be engaging with questions about it in their films, today.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was a missed opportunity in this movie, especially when you have, and the other kind of capable actor in the film was Alan Maldonado, who played Dwayne, who was sort of reprising the Ben character from Night of the Living Dead. So, I mean, you can probably put some good thoughts or some good words into that actor's mouth and have a more interesting conversation thereafter. So I felt like that was another missed opportunity for this film.
So, my override for this week, and I know it's pretty obvious, but George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. It's a much better movie than this, and if you see this without seeing Night of the Living Dead, a lot of this movie won't even make sense to you.
So that's a 2 times recommendation from us. That was also going to be my override recommendation this week. Save your time. Watch Night of the Living Dead, the '68 version from George A. Romero. It is the far superior film, and it's in the public domain. So,
yeah, due to copyright not being filed on it properly, you can watch it free. You can download it and burn it to a DVD and watch it whenever you want.
Okay, so those are our thoughts. This is our review of Mimesis. Let us know what you think. Yeah, I'm saying y'all don't have to watch this movie. Just talk to us. You can let us know in the comments down below. We'll get back to you about that. Or you can come and find us on our website, novitovideo.com. Okay, so next time on Novito Video, we'll be checking out Okja, which is the new movie from Bong Joon-ho, which is available on Netflix because it was made for Netflix by Netflix. And so thank you so much.
Thank you, and please subscribe. This has been Novito Video. I'm Carson.
I'm Catherine. Goodbye.
Goodbye.